They once wanted to blow this dam apart. Now they were saving it from collapse. The desert wind cut through the silence as a line of German prisoners in khaki overalls climbed onto the cracked spine of the Maricopa irrigation dam. Beneath them, the Colorado sun burned through the haze, glinting off the rusted wrenches and American-made drills in their hands. From a distance, it could have been any team of engineers doing repairs after a storm, until one noticed the stenciled letters on their backs, PW. 3 years earlier, men like these had placed explosives beneath concrete arches in Europe. They had flooded valleys and drowned villages under black torrents of water, convinced that destroying dams would cripple their enemies. Now, under the watch of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they were ordered to preserve what they once had been trained to annihilate. The Maricopa Water Project in Arizona, spring 1944, was no ordinary assignment. A violent monsoon had damaged the spillway, threatening the crops of more than 300 farms across the Gila Basin. With most American engineers deployed overseas, the Army turned to an unexpected workforce. Captured Wehrmacht specialists with experience in hydrology, mechanics, and construction. In the official report it read, "Reconstruction under controlled POW labor." But among the guards and farmers, the phrase passed in whispers, "The Germans are fixing our dam." Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, once attached to a Luftwaffe engineering unit, led the small group. His boots scraped the cracked surface as he surveyed the fractures in the retaining wall. 3 meters wide, he murmured in German, running his hand along the fault line. He recognized the design. It resembled a pre-war German model used near the Ruhr. For a moment, his mind flashed back to 1943, the roar of bombers over the Eder Sea, the column of water rising like a ghost. Now, the ghosts stared back at him in the reflection of an American reservoir. A U.S. officer approached, clipboard in hand. Captain William Harcourt, 38, civil engineer, polite but guarded. His younger brother had died in the Ruhr bombing, yet here he was, commanding the very men who once targeted his homeland's allies. "You understand the stakes," Harcourt said evenly. "If this wall goes, 1,000 acres are gone." Fischer nodded. He did not reply. By noon, the sound of chisels echoed across the canyon. The men worked in silence except for the rhythmic pounding of steel on stone. A few American soldiers watched uneasily, fingers near their rifles. One whispered, "They're good, too good." Another answered, "They're engineers, not magicians." That night, Fischer wrote in his diary, "Today I held a hammer, not a detonator. The same hands, a different purpose. I wonder if this is punishment or grace." The desert cooled as the moon rose over the half-drained reservoir. For the first time since their capture, the German engineers looked not at the barbed wire, but at the cracks beneath their feet. They weren't just rebuilding concrete. They were repairing something invisible that had fractured long before. The idea of what their hands were meant to create. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Morning rose over the Arizona desert with a pale orange light, revealing the dam's wounded surface like a scar across the valley. The German engineers stood in a line, eyes fixed on the water that still seeped through the cracks. For one of them, the sight cut deeper than any order could. His name was Heinrich Bauer, 35, hydrodynamic specialist, once stationed under the Luftwaffe's Dambusters division that struck at the Ruhr Valley in 1943. He had calculated the resonance of water waves, the pressure of collapsing walls, and the number of lives those calculations would end. Now, he felt the same vibrations echo under his boots, but this time they whispered of guilt instead of triumph. Harcourt handed him a survey map drawn in blue pencil. "You've done this before," he said without irony. Bauer stared at the blueprint, tracing the curve of the dam's spillway. It was almost identical to the ones he had helped to destroy along the Eder and Möhne. In those operations, the Luftwaffe used rotating, bouncing bombs designed to skim across reservoirs. Bauer had admired the precision, the ingenuity, the mathematics of annihilation. He had never imagined standing on the opposite side of that equation. At midday, the wind picked up. Dust swirled around the cracked concrete. Bauer muttered, "In Germany, we struck water to kill. Here, water feeds life." The phrase hung between him and Harcourt, who understood enough German to grasp the meaning. Neither man spoke further, but something in their silence shifted. The first fragile thread of mutual comprehension. That night, the POW barracks buzzed with small talk. Someone passed around a dented harmonica. Another carved a spoon from a piece of mesquite wood. These ordinary gestures carried the weight of survival. Bauer sat by the window, staring at the starlit reservoir. The others teased him gently. "Der Professor is dreaming again." He smiled faintly and replied, "No, I'm remembering." In a moment that would later appear in the Army Corps' project log, Bauer sketched an alternative design for the damaged spillway, suggesting a curvature that would reduce future stress during flood surges by 12%. The American foreman approved it. For the first time, a German blueprint served to preserve, not to destroy. Harcourt noted in his daily report, "Technical acumen remarkable, attitude subdued, reflective, no incidents." But in the margins, he scribbled something more personal. "Strange feeling, seeing the enemy fix what war broke. Makes one wonder who the real builder is." By dawn, Bauer could hear the faint trickle of water creeping through a sealed fracture. He closed his eyes, imagining the rivers of his homeland, the roar of the Edersee breach, the women and children drowned below. Here, the same element now whispered forgiveness. The dam stood like a mirror, half American steel, half German guilt, binding them in a silent equation of responsibility. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, and the sound rolled across the valley like a requiem for everything men once believed destruction could solve. By late summer of 1944, the Maricopa Dam site had become a strange frontier between past enmity and reluctant cooperation. The American flags flapped over the worksite, while behind the barbed fence, German engineers cleaned turbine blades and measured sediment density with the precision of men trying to atone through science. The sun burned relentlessly, but something else simmered deeper, an experiment in trust. Captain William Harcourt knew the risk. Some officers called his decision reckless. Yet he believed in one principle that seemed to outlive the war: knowledge must not die with hate. The quote came from an internal Corps of Engineers memorandum dated May 1944, scribbled in his handwriting. He had lost a brother in Europe, but grief had turned into something sterner than vengeance: discipline. He wanted results, and he knew these prisoners, if handled correctly, could deliver them. On July 12th, he handed over a full set of blueprints to the POW foreman, Carl Fischer. A few American guards muttered in disbelief. "He's giving the Kraut the plans," one said. Another spat tobacco into the dirt. "Next thing you know, they'll blow the whole place to hell." Harcourt ignored them. "We control the explosives," he replied dryly. "They control the equations." Under his supervision, Fischer and his team began recalculating the load distribution along the dam's southern wing. The math was unforgiving. Every misstep risked disaster, not only for the Americans, but also for the prisoners whose lives would be swept away first. Harcourt stood beside Fischer in the blazing heat, pointing at a crack traced in red chalk. "If we pour here before reinforcement, she'll split again." Fischer nodded, eyes narrowed, his accent thick. You trust me with your wall. I must trust you with my life." That night, Harcourt sat alone in his tent, reading through technical notes the Germans had prepared. Their handwriting was elegant, almost academic. The irony struck him. Men who once mapped destruction now drafted plans to preserve. In the camp canteen, an older sergeant remarked, "You ever think it's strange, sir, working side by side with the people we fought?" Harcourt answered, "Only when I forget we're building something that might outlast all of us." 1 week later, a shipment of steel bolts arrived from Tucson. The crates bore both American and German markings, parts salvaged from bombed factories in Bremen, repurposed by U.S. suppliers. It was as if the ghosts of industry had crossed oceans to find redemption. Fisher wrote in his small notebook that evening, "They let us build again, not for the Führer, but for the farmer. Maybe that is what civilization means, to create even when watched by your enemy." When the day ended, Harcourt locked the blueprints in his field chest and paused. The dam loomed silent, bathed in crimson light. He realized that no victory parade would ever feel as heavy as this. 2 enemies holding the same ruler, measuring the future against the ruins of the past. By September, word spread beyond the valley. The farmers who depended on the dam's water gathered at the edge of the road in pickup trucks and dusty hats, watching the prisoners work. The rumor mill turned faster than the turbines. "They're letting Germans fix our water supply," one man spat. Another added, "Next thing, they'll be running our power stations." The headlines in the Arizona Republic, dated September 17, 1944, captured the unease. Enemy hands at the dam. Tension built like the water behind the spillway. Harcourt faced complaints from the local water cooperative, some citing fears of sabotage, others fueled by simple hatred. At a town meeting in Casa Grande, an elderly farmer shouted, "You're feeding the men who tried to drown England." The army representative calmly replied, "We're not teaching them to destroy, we're teaching them to repair." But few were convinced. Inside the camp, the POWs felt the hostility like heat radiating through the wire. A guard brought in a newspaper clipping, waving it with a grin. "You made the front page, Fritz." The men said nothing. That evening, Fisher overheard 2 American workers arguing outside the fence. "They built our enemies' planes," one said. "Why give them another chance?" The reply came quietly, "Because they're the only ones who know how." Amid the uproar, the engineers continued. Their days began at dawn, marked by the clang of the mess tin and the scent of burnt coffee. They patched concrete with mixtures measured to the gram, carved rebar from recycled truck frames, and slept to the rhythmic hum of generators that powered floodlights. Bauer, still haunted by the Eder Sea, drew diagrams in the dust showing how water could flow without turbulence, his way of redeeming his calculations. One afternoon, Harcourt received an envelope from Washington approving additional funding for experimental POW labor, Infrastructure Section B. In the margin, a handwritten note read, "Monitor public sentiment, keep results classified until completion." The order was clear. Success would be useful, controversy would not. Late that night, a dust storm tore across the basin. Guards shouted through the roar as tents buckled. The POWs rushed out, shielding their faces. Fisher, without command, joined Harcourt and his men to cover the equipment. For 30 minutes, they fought wind and grit together until the storm passed. When silence returned, a guard muttered, "Didn't think they'd save our gear." Harcourt answered, "Neither did I." The next morning, the locals who had come to mock watched the Germans wade into the silt, checking for damage. No one jeered. For the first time, suspicion yielded to a wary curiosity. A farmer even tossed them a bottle of cold water through the fence. A small gesture, unnoticed by history, but heavier than any speech. The drama of war had turned into something quieter, more difficult. learning to coexist within the same dust, the same thirst, and the same dependence on the dam that now held all their futures. The heat broke in late October. A thin veil of morning mist rose from the reservoir as the last concrete panels were sealed. When the engineers tightened the final bolts, Harcourt ordered the sluice gate tested for the first time in 2 years. The steel groaned like a waking giant. Slowly, the rusted valve began to turn, releasing a single ribbon of water that cascaded into the dry canal. Everyone stopped. Even the guards lowered their rifles. The German prisoners watched the water surge through the channels they had rebuilt, rushing toward the fields that had been barren since the dam's breach. The roar grew louder until it drowned out the desert wind. Some locals standing on the embankment clapped hesitantly. Others simply stared. Fisher's eyes glistened as he whispered in German, "That sound. It's not destruction. It's mercy." Beside him, Bauer murmured, "We once made water our weapon. Now it feeds the world." The moment felt like the dam itself was breathing again. An American cameraman from the Army Pictorial Service, assigned to document POW labor projects, captured the scene on 16mm film, later archived as Hydraulic Restoration, 1945. His notes described enemy engineers witnessing first water release, emotional reaction observed. No script could have written such an irony. After the test run, Harcourt called for a break. He walked toward the POW group, holding a dented canteen. "Good work," he said quietly, offering it to Fisher. The German hesitated, then drank. Around them, the smell of wet earth filled the air, the scent of renewal. That evening, a mail truck arrived from Camp Concordia carrying letters from overseas. Most envelopes bore the familiar censorship stamps, some smeared by tears. Bauer unfolded one from his wife in Bremen. It read, "Our city is rubble, but the river still runs. I hope you see water where you are." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it in his pocket, and said to Fisher, "Maybe she'd be proud of this one thing I built." A few men gathered by the fence at dusk, writing their replies. They no longer described the war. Instead, they wrote of turbines, of irrigation ditches, of the odd kindness of an American officer who shared his tobacco. They wrote, "We are not idle. We build again." Harcourt reviewed their correspondence as regulations required. One sentence stopped him cold. "Can a man atone through work?" He stared at the words until the ink blurred. Later that night, he added a note to the camp file. Behavior exemplary, morale stable, project success rate 97%. But that was only the report. He knew what he had seen: guilt melting into purpose, hatred transformed into precision. And you, watching this now, what do you think? Can a man who once destroyed ever truly rebuild himself? Or is redemption something only others can grant? Tell me in the comments below. When the power first came alive again, the sound was not thunderous. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as if the machines themselves were unsure they deserved a second life. The repaired turbines began to turn beneath the dam, humming a low metallic rhythm that rippled across the valley. Then, one by one, the floodlights flared, slicing through the dusk. For the first time since the war began, light returned to the Maricopa Basin. The glow spread across the water, reflecting off the ripples like 1,000 tiny suns. Farmers drove out with their families, parking along the access road. Children pointed at the shimmering beams that reached up into the desert night. A few soldiers smiled, though no one dared call it celebration. Behind the chain-link fence, the German engineers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces illuminated by the lights they had restored. Bauer whispered, "It looks like home," before everything fell apart. No one answered. The hum of electricity was their only reply. Captain Harcourt approached, removing his cap. "You've done what many thought impossible," he said quietly. "The reservoir will hold." The valley's safe. Fisher saluted him, but Harcourt shook his head. No ranks here tonight. For a moment, they simply stood as men who had built something lasting. An army photographer took one final picture, the engineers standing before the lit dam, floodlights behind them, faces half in shadow. The photograph still exists in the National Archives, labeled simply Maricopa Reconstruction, POW Unit C, 1945. Later that night, in the barracks, the men lay awake under the hum of distant generators. Bauer turned to Fisher. "Do you think they'll remember who built it?" Fisher replied, "Maybe not our names, but maybe they'll remember someone let the water flow again." Outside, a coyote's cry echoed, carried by the wind over the newly filled canals. It mingled with the faint whir of the turbines, an eerie duet of nature and machinery. From the ridge, the locals looked down at the spectacle. The same farmers who had once protested now sat on their truck beds, eyes wide with quiet awe. One man, the loudest critic weeks earlier, muttered to his son, "You see that light? Those men, those Germans, helped turn it on." The boy nodded. The water coursed through the irrigation ditches, glimmering under the moonlight. It wasn't just a river anymore. It was a mirror, showing two nations reflected in the same current. To the viewer watching this decades later, would you have stood there that night watching the glow and believed that forgiveness could be built from bolts and concrete? Could light itself be an act of mercy? Sometimes redemption doesn't come in words. It hums quietly through a dam at midnight. When the war ended in 1945, the Maricopa Dam stood whole again, silent witness to a reconciliation that no treaty had written. The German engineers were gradually transferred north to repatriation camps. Their final task before departure was to sign the maintenance logs, formal acknowledgement that the structure they had repaired now belonged entirely to the United States. Yet when Fisher held the pen, he hesitated. His signature trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of leaving behind the only work that had ever made him feel clean again. The farewell came on a morning so still that even the flag above the gate hung motionless. Harcourt stood at the checkpoint as the POW convoy assembled. "You've done good work here," he said. Fisher looked back toward the dam, sunlight glinting off the water. "You gave us back our profession," he answered softly, "and with it, a reason." Harcourt extended his hand. The gesture broke regulations, but neither cared. Years later, in 1985, a maintenance crew resurfacing a section of the Maricopa Dam discovered something embedded within the concrete. A small rectangular plaque, half corroded, inscribed in faint letters, "Rebuilt 1945 by POW engineers." No one could say who placed it there. The supervisors chose not to remove it. The report simply noted, "Historical marking retained, not interfering with structure." That inscription, almost erased by time, became the only surviving testimony of men who crossed from destruction to restoration. The dam still functions today, regulating the same waters that once threatened to break its spine. Locals call it dependable, unremarkable, perhaps the highest praise for anything built by human hands. Fisher's later years were spent in Stuttgart, teaching engineering at a vocational school. In a letter to an American colleague in 1963, he wrote, "I no longer fear water. I listen to it. It reminds me of the day light returned to Arizona." The same letter mentioned a dream recurring every winter. Standing once more on the dam, hearing turbines pulse like a heartbeat, feeling the ground stable beneath his feet. Harcourt retired in 1959, never speaking publicly about the project, but his granddaughter recalled finding a photograph in his study, the one taken that night when the lights came on. On the back, he had written only one line, "They fixed more than concrete." And that is perhaps the quiet truth buried in history's margins. The bridge between guilt and grace is often made not of words or apologies, but of bolts turned by steady hands. The Maricopa Dam still hums today, its turbines pushing water through the same canals first reopened by men once sworn to destroy them. The years have softened the iron and washed away the paint, but beneath every patch of concrete lies a paradox: the fingerprints of both conqueror and captive, enemy and ally. History tends to record only victories and surrenders, yet the true story of redemption often hides in places like this, a structure rebuilt by those who once believed that only ruin proved strength. When Carl Fisher stood under that desert sun in 1944, he could not have known that his labor would outlast flags, ideologies, and orders. For him, the dam was not just a project. It was confession in stone, each strike of the hammer an unspoken prayer. For Captain Harcourt, it was proof that forgiveness can be practiced through discipline, not sentiment. Their bond was wordless, sealed by water pressure and torque measurements, and somehow that silence said more about humanity than any treaty could. We imagine war as noise, bombs, sirens, speeches. But peace, real peace, begins in quiet places. It begins when someone hands an enemy a wrench instead of a weapon. It begins when men stop calculating destruction and start calculating flow rate. The Maricopa story reminds us that redemption is rarely grand. It is patient, repetitive, built one bolt at a time until it holds. Years after the war, American tourists sometimes stopped by the dam without realizing who had mended it. They took photographs of the sunset reflected in the water and left, unaware that the light shimmering across the reservoir was born from one of history's most improbable acts of trust. Somewhere in Germany, an old engineer may have watched a river and thought of that same light, flowing endlessly. Neither American nor German, only human. So as you close this story tonight, listen for the faint sound of water against stone. That is the sound of forgiveness still working.